In the winter of 1886, the temperature in Wyoming Territory dropped so far below zero that the cattle on the northern ranches froze standing up, their legs locked into the drifted snow like fence posts. The men who owned those ranches sat by their stoves and waited for the storm to pass. They had made their calculations, weighed the risk against the cold, and decided the herd would have to take its chances until morning. Nettie Coleman did not make that calculation. She pulled on Wayne's old coat over her own, tied a rope from the barn post to her wrist so she could find her way back, and rode out into a wall of horizontal snow at 9:30 in the evening. Because 22 head of cattle were drifted into a coulee a mile and a half from the barn, and she had not survived 8 years on that 160 acres to lose them to a single night. What happened on that ride, and what it cost her, and what it finally settled in the minds of the people of Cotter's Crossing, is worth telling from the beginning. The beginning is 1875, when a young woman named Nettie Marsh left her family's house in eastern Ohio with a man named Wayne Coleman, who had a homestead claim filed on 160 acres of short grass country south of the Laramie Mountains, and a degree of confidence in his own plan that Nettie found, if she was honest with herself, slightly alarming. Wayne was not reckless. He simply believed that a thing worked if you worked it, and that the land would give back what you put into it, and that the two of them together were sufficient to the task. He said this plainly without boast. Nettie had spent enough years watching her father's careful arrangements collapse under circumstances no one had planned for that. She knew confidence alone was not a contract with the world. Still, she went. She went because Wayne believed it, and because she had reasons of her own to leave Ohio that had nothing to do with optimism, and because the land he described, wide and cold and indifferent to anyone's expectations, sounded like a place that might be honest with you, which was more than she could say for the county she'd grown up in. They arrived at Cotter's Crossing in the spring of 1875. The town was modest even by Wyoming Territory standards. A feed supplier run by a man named Burl Ames, a livery, a dry goods store, a post office that shared a wall with the church, and a scattering of homestead claims reaching south and east across the benchland. The 160 acres Wayne had claimed sat at the edge of that benchland, where the grass came in thick in wet years and thin in dry ones, and a creek ran through the lower quarter and fed a small coulee before it ran out into the open flats. Wayne built the cabin in the first summer, a low structure of notched log with a sod roof and a stone chimney that drew well once Nettie figured out the angle. She figured it out herself, testing it with strips of dampened cloth held at the flue opening, adjusting the cap twice before it held. Wayne said she had a better mechanical mind than he did, and meant it as a compliment. Nettie accepted it as a statement of fact. They ran 40 head of cattle through their first 3 seasons and built the herd steadily, learning the land's rhythms as they went, where the grass stayed greenest into August, which draws flooded in the spring thaw and which ones drained clean, how early the first frost came in, and how late the last one held. Nettie kept a notebook in which she recorded all of it, dates and temperatures and the weight of calves at weaning, and the price Burl Ames charged per hundredweight of hay when the grass ran short. She was not keeping it for any particular purpose. She was keeping it because a thing written down was a thing you could return to, and she had learned early that memory alone was not sufficient for the kind of precision the land demanded. Wayne died in February of 1878, 3 years into the claim. It was a chest fever that started as a cough after a wet November and deepened through December and January until it had taken most of what he weighed. The doctor who rode out from Cotter's Crossing shook his head in a way that communicated the situation without requiring him to say it plainly, and Wayne died on a Saturday morning with the light coming low and thin through the east window and Nettie's hand over his. He was 31 years old. She was 26. He had left her the deed, properly witnessed and filed with the Territorial Land Office, and 40 head of cattle, and a note of $230 owed to Burl Ames for the previous winter's feed. He had also left her, though neither of them would have named it this way, every practical thing she had watched and learned and done alongside him in 3 years of working that ground, which turned out to be more than either of them had separately realized. The valley did not give her long to grieve before it began to give her advice. Burl Ames came out the following week, not unkindly, to discuss the debt. He stood in the yard with his hat in his hand and told her that the note would keep for a season if she needed time to arrange a sale, and that he knew a buyer in Laramie who paid fair prices for going concerns and wouldn't discount too heavily for the circumstance. Nettie looked at him for a moment and asked if he would discount a man's note for the circumstance of being widowed, and Burl said that was not the same thing at all, and she said she was aware of that. And could he add the spring's hay requirements to the note at the same terms, and he said he could. The first suitor arrived within 2 weeks of Wayne's burial. His name was Dodd, a dryland farmer from the next valley who had lost his wife the previous autumn, and was, by his own account, in an efficient frame of mind about the situation. He sat at her table and explained that a partnership of properties would benefit them both, that he had a son who could work the stock, and that he was prepared to assume the Coleman note as part of the arrangement. He used the word arrangement 7 times in the space of one conversation. Nettie poured him a second cup of coffee, because she had been raised to be hospitable, and told him she would give it consideration. After he left, she sat at the table for a long while, looking at Wayne's coat hanging by the door. And then she went out and fed the cattle, and did not think about Dodd again except to notice, in the weeks that followed, that the efficiency of the arrangement he described would have required giving up the deed. She did not give up the deed. She wrote to her younger sister Hattie in Ohio that spring, a letter that took 2 weeks to arrive and described the situation plainly without sentiment, and Hattie wrote back with equal plainness, asking what Nettie needed and when she should come. Nettie wrote back that she did not need help, and then spent a week reconsidering, and wrote again to say that company would not be unwelcome if Hattie had no pressing reason to stay in Ohio. Hattie arrived on the 1st of June with a trunk, a practical disposition, and a capacity for silence that Nettie had always valued in her. She brought also a copy of a book on soil management that she had borrowed from their uncle's library without asking, which turned out to be the most useful thing anyone delivered to the homestead that year. The first drought came in the summer of 1879 and ran through the following 2 seasons in the manner that Wyoming droughts did, not arriving with fanfare but simply staying after the regular pattern of rain failed to resume. The creek dropped by July and was barely running in August, and the grass on the upper bench cured before it had reached half its normal height. Nettie had cut her hay 6 weeks earlier than Wayne had ever done, reading the drought out of the dry smell of the June wind and the way the chokecherry had bloomed thin and early. The early cut gave her a stack that would carry the 40 head through winter, though barely. She traded 2 weeks of labor to a neighbor named Orvis, helping to dig out and timber a new well section on his place, in exchange for water rights to his lower seep through the dry months. The cattle stayed watered. The hay held. Hattie took on the kitchen garden with a methodical thoroughness that produced more food from 2 acres of rocky ground than Nettie would have thought possible, partly through the soil management book and partly through a willingness to haul creek water by the bucket every morning before the temperature climbed. The neighbors watched all of this without comment, or rather with the particular kind of comment that is not addressed to the person being observed. Nettie heard enough of it through Burl Ames and the dry goods store to know that the general opinion was that she was managing adequately for the time being, but that adequately for the time being was not a long-term condition, and that winter would test what summer had only strained. Winter tested it. The cattle lost weight. 3 calves were born early, and 2 of them did not survive the cold. Nettie recorded all of it in her notebook with the same precision she had always used, because a thing written down could be planned around the next time, and she intended there to be a next time. Prescott came in the 2nd year of the drought, a cattle buyer from Cheyenne who had land adjacent to the county's east quarter, and a manner that suggested he considered himself a practical man, helping a woman in a difficult situation. He was taller than Dodd and more polished in his language, and he brought with him a written proposal that he had taken the trouble to have drawn up by a lawyer, which Nettie thought was either very organized or a sign that he had been refused before. The proposal offered to retire the Coleman note, consolidate the 2 properties, and provide Nettie with a monthly household allowance. She read it through twice. She noted that the deed would transfer to Prescott upon marriage and that the allowance was not indexed to anything. She handed it back to him and told him she appreciated the thoroughness of the document and that her answer was no. He asked if she had fully considered the difficulty of her position. She said she thought about it most days and had arrived at the same answer each time. He left before supper. Harlan followed Prescott by about 8 months in the spring of 1881 and had the particular disadvantage of arriving in a season when the grass had finally begun to recover and the cattle were looking better than they had in 2 years, which meant Nettie was in no mood to be told she needed rescuing. Harlan was a neighbor's cousin from over the territorial line in Nebraska, a decent man by all appearances who said frankly that he was not getting younger, and the range was harder to work alone than it used to be. Nettie said she had no argument with either of those observations. He asked if she had thought about what the winters would be like in another 10 years. She said she had thought about it and had decided that the winters in another 10 years would require the same things the winters now required, which were preparation, knowledge, and the willingness to do the work. He departed without hostility, and Nettie thought he was probably a reasonable person who had simply never encountered a woman who had made up her mind about her own land. The drought broke fully in 1882, and the grass came back in the deep way it did after a long dry stretch, saturating the benchland right up to the upper fence line. The cattle put on weight through the summer, and by fall Nettie had the figures she had been working toward since Wayne died. She rode into Cotter's Crossing on a Tuesday in October and walked into Burl Ames's feed supply and laid $230 on the counter in coin and small bills, the full amount of the note plus 4 years of accumulated interest at the rate Burl had set. Burl counted it twice without speaking, then wrote the receipt out by hand and stamped it paid in full and slid it across the counter. Nettie folded it and put it in her coat pocket. Burl said, in a voice that had something careful in it, that she had done a solid thing. She said she had paid a debt, which was a common activity, and that she would need the winter's hay quoted for the new season. Burl quoted it without hesitation, and she left. She did not smile until she was back on the road south toward the homestead, and then only briefly, because the drive home was a long one, and she needed to pay attention to the road. If you have ever wondered whether a single payment can change the way a place looks at a person, the answer is that it can, though not all at once. It arrives in small adjustments. The way people at Burl's counter addressed her in the following months, the way the dry goods store owner began extending her credit without the pause he had always left in the conversation before doing so, the way Orvis stopped suggesting she consider selling the eastern quarter when the grass ran thin. The valley did not announce a change of opinion. It simply began to behave as if the question had been answered. The second drought came in 1883 and ran through 1884, and this one was harder because it arrived without warning, a winter that had been wet enough followed by a spring that simply did not rain again. The creek dropped faster than it had during the first drought, and the grass on the upper bench gave out entirely by midsummer. Nettie sold 14 head in the summer of 1883 to avoid carrying them through a winter she could not feed them through, reducing the herd to 26, and then sold 4 more calves in the early fall, bringing the count to 22. It was the lowest the herd had been since Wayne died. She recorded the sales in her notebook with the date and the price and the name of the buyer, and then she sat at the kitchen table while Hattie made supper and looked at the entry for a long time without saying anything. And Hattie did not ask what she was thinking, because she already knew. The neighbors noticed, of course. Doubt had a long memory in a small valley, and the sight of Nettie selling cattle gave it something to return to. There was nothing unkind in it, or not much. It was simply the communal accounting that a close-settled place could not help keeping. The noting of who was up and who was down, and whether the patterns were beginning to look like a direction. Burl Ames said nothing directly to Nettie, but she heard through the dry goods store owner's wife, a woman named Clara who was constitutionally unable to keep news to herself, that Burl had allowed as how the Coleman place was in a difficult season, and that it was a shame there was no man on the property to weather it. Nettie thanked Clara for the information and bought her flour and went home. Harlan did not return, but in the spring of 1884, near the end of the second drought, a man named Reuben appeared. He was a rancher from 30 miles north who had heard about the Coleman homestead through the valley's informal accounting and had formed on the basis of that accounting the opinion that the time might be right for a conversation. He was older than the others, perhaps 50, with a careful way of speaking that suggested he had thought through what he meant to say before he said it. He arrived in April when the grass was still short and the cattle were thin from winter, and sat across from Nettie at the kitchen table and said that he wanted to be straightforward with her. He said he thought she was a capable woman who had done a hard thing for a long time, and that he was not coming to rescue her, but to propose a partnership of equals. He said he had 112 acres north of town that adjoined good water, and that a combined operation would be stronger than either alone. Nettie listened to all of it. She asked whether the deed to her 160 acres would remain in her name. Reuben said that was a reasonable question and that the arrangement could be structured that way. Nettie said she would think about it. She thought about it for 2 weeks, during which the grass began to come back and the creek rose, and one of the best cows dropped a strong calf that stood and nursed within the hour. She thought about what Reuben had said about a partnership of equals, and she thought about the precise legal distance between a reasonable proposal and an arrangement, and she thought about the fact that she was 32 years old and had been running 160 acres for 6 years, and that whatever she was doing it, and that the deed was in her name, and that she had come this far by knowing her own land better than anyone else knew it. She sent Reuben a letter in May, polite and brief, declining the proposal and wishing him well in his operation. The third drought came in the summer of 1886 and was longer in arriving and harder when it got there than either of the previous 2. By September, the benchland was brown to the fence line, and the creek had dropped to a seep in the lower quarter. Nettie had been cutting hay since early July, working the lower meadow with a scythe from first light until the heat made it impossible, and then again in the late afternoon, and Hattie had helped her. And the stack behind the barn was tall, but not as tall as Nettie wanted. She calculated it twice against the weight of the herd and the length of the average Wyoming winter, and arrived at the same conclusion both times, which was that if the winter ran long, she would be feeding the last bales in February and hoping for an early thaw. The winter of 1886 to 1887 did not offer an early thaw. It offered the opposite. The first serious snow came in early November, and the cold that followed it was the kind that settled in and stayed, dropping through December to temperatures that the old-timers in Cotter's Crossing said they had not seen since the 70s. Cattle were dying on the big outfits north of the territory line. Men were finding horses frozen in their stalls. Burl Ames's account books for that winter showed a run on hay and grain that emptied his warehouse by the first week of January. And Nettie, who had planned ahead and bought her winter supply in September, was one of the few small operators in the valley who was not scrambling. She was managing, which was a different thing from comfortable, but it was a thing. Then, on the evening of the 15th of January, the temperature dropped again, and a northwest wind came up that turned the existing snow into a moving white wall, and Nettie looked out the north window of the cabin and understood that the cattle she had moved to the lower pasture that afternoon were now between her and a coulee that drifted solid in a wind like this one. A drifted coulee in a storm of this intensity did not give back what it took. She had seen it on a neighbor's place in the first drought and remembered it with the precision of her notebook, which was in her hands 30 seconds after she made the decision. She read the entry quickly, confirming what she already knew about the coulee's depth and the cattle's last known position. Then put the notebook on the shelf and pulled on her heaviest wool underlayers, and then her regular working clothes over those, and then Wayne's old coat over all of it. The coat that had been hanging by the door for 8 years and still held the shape of his shoulders in the collar. She cut a length of rope from the spool by the barn wall and tied one end to the post inside the barn door and the other end around her wrist, enough to reach the first fence line. From the fence line to the lower pasture gate she knew by feel, had walked it in the dark enough times that the ground spoke through her boots. She saddled the horse in the dark by touch alone, the buckles on the bridle familiar as her own hands, and rode out into the storm. The wind was a physical thing. It pushed against the horse's shoulder and tried to turn him, and he resisted it with the steady, reluctant courage of a working animal that trusts its rider's judgment even when the judgment seems questionable. Nettie kept her face down and navigated by the count of her horse's strides, which she had also recorded at some point, not for this purpose, but because she recorded things. 240 strides from the barn to the pasture gate. She counted them in the storm, her lips moving, the numbers her only geography. She found the cattle at the coulee's edge, 17 of them pressed together against the wind, the other 5 already into the upper end of the drift and standing with their chests against the packed snow, working their legs to stay above it. She got down and worked with her hands in the near-zero temperature, pulling at the snow with her bare fingers when her gloves came off in the effort, shouting at the cattle in the tones that moved them, the low, steady call that Wayne had taught her, and she had refined over 8 years into something the herd responded to without thinking. She got them moving, all 22. She pushed them ahead of her toward the pasture gate, the horse working the edges like a good cutting horse did, and she drove them back across the benchland in the dark with the wind at their backs, which helped, and got the last one through the barn door at 11:15. She was sitting on the barn floor when Hattie found her 20 minutes later, her back against the hay bales and her hands in her lap. 2 fingers on her right hand had gone white, and then hard during the ride, and they stayed that way through the night despite Hattie's careful attention. The doctor from Cotter's Crossing came out 2 days later when the storm broke and confirmed what Hattie had already understood. Nettie lost the top joints of those 2 fingers to the frost. The rest of the hand healed cleanly. She was back at work in 3 weeks. The valley heard about the ride before the storm had fully cleared. These things moved quickly in a small community, passed from Hattie to Clara to the dry goods store, and outward from there in every direction. And what the valley heard was not a dramatic telling, but a plain one, because Hattie was plain in her speech and reported only what had happened, which was that her sister had ridden out alone in a blizzard at 9:30 in the evening and brought 22 head of cattle back from a drifted coulee, at a cost of 2 fingers and a 3-week recovery. The facts were sufficient. The valley did not require embellishment. Reuben came back in the spring of 1888, and this time he said nothing about partnership or deeds or combined operations. He sat at the table and drank his coffee and asked after the cattle, and Nettie told him the herd had come through the winter at 22 head, which she intended to rebuild over the next several seasons, and that she expected to have the upper bench fully restocked within 3 years. Reuben nodded and said that the upper bench was good grass when it rained. Nettie said she had found it to be. He finished his coffee and set the cup down and looked at her for a moment with an expression that was not pity and not admiration, but something more settled than either, and said that she had done a serious piece of work on this place. Nettie said she had done what the place required. He stood, put his hat on, and rode north toward his own land. And he did not come back after that, and the quality of his not coming back was different from all the others. It was not defeat. It was recognition. Burl Ames said nothing to Nettie directly, but the conversation at his counter changed around her in the way that conversations do when a settled question no longer needs discussing. She had been for 10 years a subject of the valley's ongoing accounting, the widow Coleman, the woman holding on, the place without a man to work it, the debt that might not get paid. After the winter of 1886 to 1887, she was not those things anymore. She was simply the Coleman place, 160 acres on the South Benchland, running 22 head in the spring of 1888, which would be more in the fall, which would be more the following year. She did not find it necessary to address the change directly. The valley's opinion had never been something she spent energy on, except as a practical matter. The credit at the feed supply, the water rights negotiated with Orvis, the hay prices at the end of a dry summer. What the valley thought of her was information, sometimes useful and sometimes not. What the land required was a different kind of accounting, and that one she kept herself. The rebuilding took the time she had estimated and a little more. She bought 8 bred heifers in the fall of 1888 from a rancher in the next county, who was reducing his operation, paying a fair price and no more, and she bought 6 more the following year. By 1891, the herd was 41 head, back to what Wayne had left her. By 1895, it was 62. By the early years of the new century, after 2 good wet seasons and a run of strong calves, she was carrying 90 head on the 160 acres, which was close to the carrying capacity of the benchland in a reasonable year. And she knew to a pound what that capacity was, because she had been watching it for 25 years and writing it down. Hattie had stayed. This was not something either of them had formally arranged. Hattie had arrived in June of 1878 as company that would not be unwelcome, and then the first drought had come, and then the debt payment, and then the second drought, and at some point the question of whether she would stay had simply stopped being a question. She married a quiet man from Cotter's Crossing named Aldous in 1884, and Aldous proved to be the kind of man who found it natural to be useful where he was needed. And they built a small house on the eastern edge of the Homestead acreage with Nettie's blessing and deeded portion. And Hattie's children grew up knowing the Coleman benchland as naturally as they knew their own yard. The oldest boy learned cattle work beside Nettie before he was 10, and she taught him with the same patient precision Wayne had used with her, showing him the things that could only be learned by watching the land long enough to see its patterns. There were Sunday mornings in the kitchen that Nettie held to as a fixed point across all those years. Coffee at the kitchen table after the morning chores, Hattie across from her with her hands wrapped around her cup, the children in and out, Aldous reading by the window. No particular agenda to the morning, no subjects required. The creek audible in the summer through the open door, the wind audible in the winter through the gaps the sod had never fully sealed, no matter how many times they banked it. Nettie poured from the same blue enamel pot that had been Wayne's mother's, its handle worn to bare metal on the grip side. A life built slowly looks different from the inside than it does from any description of it. From the outside, Nettie's decades on the Coleman homestead resolved into a simple account. A woman who had held land that the valley expected her to lose, who had survived 3 droughts and a blizzard that cost her 2 fingers, who had refused 4 men and outlasted the collective opinion that she could not do the thing she was doing. That account was accurate as far as it went. It did not include the specific weight of a February morning when the haystack was lower than she had planned, and the temperature outside was 15 below, and the cattle needed feeding regardless. It did not include the particular satisfaction of reading the notebook entries from a dry summer against a wet summer and seeing the patterns that let her plan, or the way the benchland smelled in early June when the grass was coming in full, a smell she had known for 25 years and still stopped to notice. It did not include Hattie's voice through the kitchen window on a summer evening, or the way Aldous had fixed the north fence line without being asked the summer after the blizzard and said nothing about it. Nettie ranched the Coleman homestead until her hands would no longer hold the work. By her mid-50s, the right hand, the one the frost had taken the 2 finger joints from, had stiffened further in the cold seasons, and by 60, she had begun to let Hattie's oldest son carry the heavier chores, while she directed and recorded and kept the accounting that kept the operation solvent. The herd stayed at 90 head through the first decade of the new century, steady as a river in a good year. She died in 1919 at 67, in the spring, in the cabin she had shared with Wayne and then alone, and then with Hattie's family all around her. The Wyoming Territory had become Wyoming the state by then, 28 years prior, and Cotter's Crossing had grown enough to have 2 streets and a school, and the benchland south of town was settled in a way it had not been when Wayne filed his claim. Nettie had seen all of it arrive without much surprise, because she had been watching the land long enough to know that everything changed eventually except the basic requirements of water and grass and the willingness to work. Hattie sat with her through the last days and was present at the end, which was as it should have been. Hattie was in her late 50s by then, with the weathered steadiness that Wyoming put into the women who stayed long enough to earn it. And she sat on the same side of the bed she had always sat on, and held Nettie's hand, the stiffened one, and did not require conversation. They buried Nettie Coleman on the hillside above the creek, where the ground was soft enough in the spring thaw to dig, and the view took in all 160 acres and the benchland beyond. Wayne was already there, the marker weathered but legible, and they placed her beside him with a stone that gave her name and her years and nothing else, because a stone that gave nothing else trusted the land below it to say the rest. The coffee pot sat on the kitchen shelf for the rest of that spring, and then Hattie began using it again, because it was a good pot, and because it had always been used, and because the kitchen table was still the right place to sit in the morning with your hands wrapped around something warm. The best things do not arrive the way you plan them. They arrive the way that land does, slowly and without announcement, and you only know what they were by looking back at all the seasons they required. Hattie's oldest son worked the Coleman homestead for another 2 decades after Nettie's death, and his own children after him, and the 160 acres stayed in the family through the middle of the last century, which meant they stayed through seasons that tested them and seasons that did not, through dry years and wet ones, through prices that made the accounting work, and prices that did not. The notebook Nettie had kept for 41 years was still in the kitchen when her grandnephew finally boxed the house in the 1950s, and he kept it, not because it was particularly useful by then, but because it was particular, which was different, and because the handwriting in it was the handwriting of a woman who had looked at her land long enough to see what it actually was, and had written it down in case it mattered later. It mattered. It matters still. On the hillside above the creek, in the place where the benchland turns and the valley opens wide below it, the markers stand in the grass among the wild asters that come back every August without anyone planting them. Wayne stone and netties, the dates worn thin by weather, the space between them narrow. From there you can see the full reach of the 160 acres, the upper bench where the grass goes deep in a good year, the lower pasture where the coulee runs, the line of the creek through the willows at the bottom quarter. In the evening light, the whole of it turns the particular gold that short grass country turns at the end of a long day, and it looks exactly like a thing that was worth holding on to. If you know someone who held a piece of hard ground longer than anyone thought they could, leave their name in the comments. This valley knew one such person, and she is worth remembering. And if stories like this one are what you come back for, there are more of them where this one came from.